We started pretty small at churches and ended up at a higher number because the idea of kids leading a youth group came up where there might be less adult supervision. So through the discussion, we have reached a point where the ordinance is, it has been reviewed by the city attorney, it's been reviewed by staff, and we feel comfortable moving forward with a recommendation to the city council. On the right is the buffer map. The map won't be part of the ordinance. This was simply a visual as to what it would look like for us to work with. So for reference, the ordinance will not have a map, which would probably require some updating quite frequently. So again, the ordinance was reviewed and had some minor edits from the city attorney with Kennedy and Graven. And then again, the action tonight is to complete the public hearing and provide recommendation to the city council. Do you have any questions, discussion? I know we've talked about it at length for quite a few meetings.
Just the one question I have, Kennedy and Graven, the lawyers, what was their feeling on it? I heard some of what the lawyer had said. It's might be hard to enforce without a statute in place.
Correct.
And is there any inherent risk that we put the city at by adopting an ordinance like this without precedents or minimal precedents by other cities?
So leaving some areas that are not buffered in the community, we believe gives us some room where if someone were looking to place a level 3 sex offender in town, it is possible for them to be placed here. If the community was entirely covered, we believe we would open ourselves up to an exclusionary zoning case, but based on the buffers that we've created, staff and the city attorney agree that it generally looks okay. It is anticipated that the state will likely make a ruling at some point in the future just based on the amount of ordinances that are being passed right now, just so it's universal across the board. So,
And on a national level, it's been accepted at other states or statute.
sure.
So, okay.
There were a few language edits from the city attorney. They were pretty minor. We added a definition for place of worship, which wasn't included in a previous draft. Beyond that, there was an addition of one of the exceptions, which was that an offender would be able to live with a family member, just because it's been shown that pretty heavily aids in rehabilitation of the predator. So that's exception number 7 on the screen right now.
So, Aaron, we've had the opportunity to discuss this over several different planning commission meetings, and we've had some good citizen advocates that have given us some good background and history on this. What's unique now about tonight is it's open for public hearing, and there's been broader notice to the community, right? So I understand that I've seen the petition that's been prepared by residents. Has anyone spoken from the public about any concerns?
Sure.
There seems to be pretty broad support, but I was just curious if there's anybody from any perspective having any concerns with this.
I haven't heard any concerns saying that the ordinance would be an issue. Kelly Omdahl, who's been working pretty closely with the Planning Commission on the ordinance, is on vacation, but she sends her thanks and praises to the Planning Commission. She organized the online petition, and she gave me an update this morning that she had 108 signatures from residents, but I haven't heard anything negative.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we open it up for discussion? Well, with that, we do have a public hearing tonight, so I will go ahead and open the public hearing. And for anyone in the audience who would like to share any comments or thoughts about the predatory offender ordinance, you're welcome to step up to the podium and state your name and address, and we'd be happy to hear your perspective.
All at once.
My name is Julie Murray. I live at 8380 Kelzer Pond in Victoria. We've lived here 11 years. I have 2 daughters. I have an 11-year-old and I have a 12-year-old. We moved to Victoria because it's a safe place to raise kids, and we want to keep it that way. And I am a signator on the petition and certainly have worked with Kelly in this, and I really want to see it go through. So please, if you would, protect our kids.
Thank you.
I'm Stacy Elman, and I'm a resident of Victoria too. I have two daughters that are 14 and 9, and I'm also a person that signature on that what was it called?
The petition?
The petition. And I definitely support it to keep our community safe, and that's one of the reasons we moved to Victoria too.
Just really quick before you go, can you just state your address real quick?
Sure, I'm at 2546 Woods Drive.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since you're the only two that have attended tonight, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing, but I want to thank you both for your interest and participation. Any further discussion? I mean, one comment that I'll just add for the record is that even though we may not be discussing this at length tonight or questioning many aspects of it, I think that's only representative of the past discussions that we've had to get us to this point. So I know that we've had some really good, broad discussions at past meetings, and so at this point, it seems much more straightforward to me this evening than it would otherwise if we were just addressing this for the first time now tonight. So I don't want any of you in the audience or others watching the streaming to think that we're not taking this seriously. I think we very much have in the past. So is there any other questions or discussion we want to have before we move forward?
I was going to say really the same thing. You know, we've talked about this, 2 or 3 times now, and, I've never heard it's all been about, what's the right way to do this? What are the right buffer zones? It's never really been about, is this the right thing to do? So, to me, I don't think there's any reason to, go against what we've been doing.
Very well said. And I think that we've used that process to evaluate the buffer distances and categorizing various aspects in our community where children gather, and that's what's gotten us to this point. So
I'd agree.
with that, anybody like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion supporting a resolution recommending approval of the adoption of ordinance 1075, designated predatory offender residency restrictions as written.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. So this will go forward as a recommendation to City Council at the next meeting, I assume, right, Ben?
Correct, yes.
Great. Thank you. All right, moving on to our next item this evening is a discussion item, and we're going to talk about the residential chapter of zoning and land use regulations. Aaron, is this one yours again?
It is, yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll also, if you don't want to stay for the riveting conversation, you're more than welcome.
You can.
Yeah.
You certainly can stay.
Trust me, you don't want
Thank
to
you.
stay either.
Thank you, ladies.
Okay, moving on to the discussion. Tonight we have the residential districts before the Planning Commission. We have also had this discussion before with the group, both with the Planning Commission and at the joint meeting with the City Council and the Planning Commission in September. As you'll recall, we are trying to move towards a residential district that breaks down some of the uses, the densities, and the housing types that might be in each neighborhood. Currently, we are operating with 3 residential districts. We have R1, which is primarily single family. We do have a multiple residence section and the Lake Minnetonka residential section. Most of the development that has happened over the past chunk of years has happened through a planned unit development. So based on what we have currently for our residential district, a lot of the developments don't fit those requirements that we're looking for. So moving to the 4 districts that we have proposed tonight, we are hoping to move towards a more uniform way of development where we're not using a PUD every time that we have a new neighborhood coming in. We're hoping that this will allow for greater clarity for staff, developers, and residents, just so they understand. I live in an R2 neighborhood. My neighbor is R4. That's why it looks different, as opposed to a condition that could be in the conditional use permit for planned unit development, which can get bogged down and tricky pretty quickly. On the screen, we have the R1 and the R2 district. So the residential districts start with R1, which is exclusive to single family. It is pretty close to what we have right now for our R1 district. The minimum lot area continues to be the same, so this is the large lot single family development. Moving on to R2, which is the second one down, it starts to open up a little bit more with the types of uses that we would expect to see in the R2. So it's single family, compact single family, semi-detached lot, or townhome. And you'll see as you move down the lot width, the lot area, and the lot depth start to shift a bit depending on the type of unit that we expect to see within the specific zoning district. You'll also see a new addition to the minimum finished floor area per unit. So currently we use an impervious surface calculation. Many of them that have come in recently have allowed for 35% of the lot to be hardcover. So in addition, we want to have a dialogue with the Planning Commission about possibly also using a floor area ratio, which is the FAR that you'll see. I have a diagram, which will make it probably easier. So on the right is a pretty good look at how a floor area ratio can look different. So something that made it easier for me to digest is to think about a rambler versus a two-story home. So where the FAR is 1, it would take up the entire lot if it was a rambler. If it's the middle one on the FAR as 1, it would be a 2-story at half the size of the rambler. And then moving to the right again, a 3-story, but reduced again in the footprint. It can be a little tricky to wrap your head around. I will happily walk through it if you would like again. So the FAR measures a building's total floor area in relation to the lot size. And it's a pretty simple calculation of the gross building area divided by the total buildable lot area. And it only includes stories that are above ground. So a finished basement would not be included in this. It's an effective way to calculate the bulk or the mass of the building volume on site. And of course, the higher the FAR, the greater the building volume. So if we need to break it down at all, we're more than happy to do it. We just want to open it up to see if this is something that we should be moving towards, something that seems too hard to grasp, and just another tool in our toolkit for the different residential districts. We did start to include it when the densities got a little bit higher. We're not proposing to use it likely in the single family section just because the lot could be so large, and then having a floor area ratio could really push the house to be pretty huge, which we don't want to have a requirement that's not attainable. So we started using it when the lots got a little bit smaller and the density went up a bit.
Just a quick question, Aaron. So if it's a multi-level home and part of that is below grade, anything below grade does not count?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Aaron, can you expand a little bit about that now in terms of making the connection to the impervious surface?
Sure.
Maybe as an example.
We do anticipate moving forward that we will include both the impervious surface coverage and the floor area ratio, so it won't go away. But it allows us to have a minimum finished floor area in a translatable way. So you could have, in the compact single-family lot, it could be a rambler at 1,400 square feet, or it could be a 2-story where it's 2 levels of 700 square feet.
One other way to think about it, I think even since I started here, there's been a lot of discussion when we've talked about creating different setbacks and having different lot sizes, that there's this feeling like if all we did was allow for smaller lots and lesser setbacks, that all of a sudden we're still going to get the large homes, and it's going to feel like you're just putting the same size homes on a smaller lot. That's where the developer's potentially winning, and that's not really the intent. What we're trying to do is provide for some economies of scale, that property is expensive to develop here. There's going to be different types of housing that we can accommodate. This FAR just allows us to kind of be responsible with doing smaller lots, that we're not allowing for the big homes to all of a sudden take over these smaller lots, where that's where we're trying to get these different housing types into the community. Does that make sense?
So the FAR, for clarification, is going to give us minimums and maximums per lot, along with the impervious surface, just another measurement.
Correct, yes.
All right, thank you.
But we're stating it only as a minimum, right? When we look at that, we're
The
talking about.
impervious surface provides that maximum. So when we get to that, you'll have a threshold that you can't go above.
And something to think about too is we also will keep max height. So someone wouldn't be able to put somehow a 6-story single-family home on a lot to get that FAR number.
So in our 2,000 square foot, just on the R1 single-family lot, minimum finished floor area, attached garages, part of that, it's unfinished, so that would, so it'd be
So usually
2,000
it's
for the house.
main level. If there's an upper floor that's finished, that would count. If there's a lower area that's finished, that would count towards that 2,000 square feet.
Let's go back to R1, using minimum floor area. So the minimum finished floor area, so I build a Rambler.
Yep.
The basement's not finished.
Mhm.
That doesn't count. So you're saying the minimum size of a Rambler in single family is 2,000 square feet?
So we're not anticipating using it in R1
Okay.
because the lot size could be so large, with 17,500 being the minimum. A lot could be an acre, and trying to put an FAR on that we thought was tricky.
I don't think he's asking the FAR, just the minimum finished floor area. So the 2,000 square feet, yes, that is what we're saying.
And
That in the R1 district, if you were to build a Rambler, either the footprint of that main level needs to be 2,000 square feet, which I would say is fairly typical here. That's actually somewhat small for areas that are R1 today. This does not include anything that's been done as a PUD. If we just looked at just the areas of the community that are straight residential zoning only, most of those footprints are gonna, we went through this because we were like, do we have it as 2,200? Do we have it as 26? Most of the homes that are in here are far in excess of the 2,000 finished square feet.
And I would challenge a little bit and say that's pretty excessive in a lot of applications.
Okay.
Looking at both the 1,800 number and the 2,000 square foot number. If we're trying to maintain more flexibility and affordability within our community. The minimum that I'm seeing in other communities, 1,500 is pretty substantial, 15 to 1,600.
Mhm.
When you start pushing 2,000 square feet, well, I'm doing, then you figure another 1,800 finished below. You're looking probably in our community based on lot prices about a $600,000 to $700,000 build job, which might put in a Rambler in the R1 with that kind of square footage in today's market in our community when lots are running about 2 to 220, just whatever that's worth. I just think that number might be a little bit large.
So can I ask a clarifying question here? Something you talked about at the beginning. I think what you said was that this is not, we're not setting this out to be enforceable zoning. This is more directional for the community so they understand what could be in their neighborhood?
So are you asking for like future development?
Yes.
So this would apply only to future development. We wouldn't go back and rezone anything.
Right, but for future development, so is this telling the community, here's what could be in your neighborhood? Or is this, if I want to build a house and it's zoned for R1, I have to meet these requirements?
Both.
Both. Okay, so it is an enforceable ordinance.
It would be an enforceable ordinance once adopted.
Gotcha. Okay. I misunderstood that. Thank you.
So, just another point of clarity, I don't know if it's, if we're looking at just the R1, and we kind of changed, going back to principal use, permitted use, conditional uses. I noticed we changed it, the language from our previous, or our current ordinance, where we moved some of them out of a conditional use into principal use. Some stay the same. Was there a reason for that overall? Did you find that maybe it fit better as a principal use? Because I don't see schools, nursing homes, state licensed group homes as a principal use in an R1 personally. I see that more of an R2 or a conditional use type situation if we were to have it. especially that, the state licensed group homes and the nursing homes, retirement communities.
So our ordinance, in many cases, we did move away from having as many conditional uses as what was in the existing ordinance. In some cases, we were moving conditional uses to being accessory instead of principal uses, but you're correct. There are some things like elementary schools, the group homes, those types of things that we do have as principal uses. The one thing I'd just say to keep in mind is you still have to have a lot that will accommodate that use, meet all the setbacks. There's usually going to be a dialogue if a developer comes in with raw land and wants to do a subdivision that includes any of those other things that are not just single-family homes. So there will be other things during that review process of going through rezoning to allowing for those things to happen that will be factors of consideration for the city. Just because we moved it from a conditional use into a principal doesn't mean the city doesn't still have an evaluation that takes place that provides for those uses to end up being allowed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I guess the size of the lot's going to determine the size of the building and how many residents they would have in it.
Right.
It's just, usually when you say a group home and retirement communities, you're talking about high density, or at least medium density.
Yeah, in some cases, they could simply just be like the Bethesda Lutheran home next to Lions Park. It's a group home facility. They needed a larger lot. It's not just going to go into a typical residential lot layout, but that's something that's at the similar density. They'd just do some other things through buffering and some setbacks from other single-family homes that makes it appropriate to fit into that neighborhood.
Right. I trust your judgment, and I'm just curious how it shifted.
Yeah.
And
Can I stay on that for a second though? Because Todd, you just said something I'm just not sure is true, which is the lot size is going to dictate the type of facility that could go in. Because I'm actually I'm thinking about as our community is growing, and you've got one development adjacent to undeveloped farmland, which frequently happens, and then it gets developed, and then it's adjacent to more undeveloped farm. But is the same challenge going to be lingering that, so one development goes up, and the potential use across the street when that farmland finally develops could be anything from small single-family homes to a large group home or a worship facility.
Other than their plat would have to identify the lots that would accommodate those uses. And so you're still going to get a preliminary plat to review that, let's say a school's incorporated into that project. You're still going to have a lot. The developer's still going to say, I'm reserving this 10-acre, 20-acre piece to have a school, and we're surrounding it with single-family homes. Same thing with a group home. A group home traditionally is not just going to fit on a single-family lot with one sewer, one water connection.
Right, but I'm talking about the situation where, say we enact this ordinance today, and there's likely some developments that currently exist, or let's say a new development gets built next year, and those new homeowners purchase those homes. It's across the street from undeveloped farmland, but there's no plat today that dictates what that farmland is going to be.
Yep.
It could be converted to R1, or maybe it's presumed to be R1 today. But I could buy a house in that development today, expecting it to be single family across the road, but couldn't at any point in time that R1 enable some of these other alternative uses? Say 5 years from now, when that undeveloped farmland gets developed. Am I thinking about that right?
You are. The one thing I'm just challenging you to think about is if we went through the typical process, because they're still going to go through rezoning. Let's jump to an aerial.
And I'm just thinking of this from the standpoint of one of the reasons why we're doing this is to create predictability for when people are investing in the community or purchasing a home, and they've got the expectation about well, I know that that's going to be developed across the street or in my backyard at some point in time,
Yep.
but my real estate agent or the city tells me that it's going to be single-family residential, and I'm okay with that. But then if I find out 5 or 10 years later that it's something very different from that, does that take us back to some of the challenges that we were trying to overcome with this?
So let's just walk through what the process looks like. Let's just assume this development, Wasserman Lake Woods, went in. Houses are all on the north side of the street, and then someone's coming in. They're gonna do this farmland as R1. The notification process, they have to go and rezone the project from the property from agriculture to R1. There's a notice that we would send to the neighbors in this development that would say, developers coming in, they're rezoning from agriculture to R1, and the intent is they have 50 single-family lots and they've got 1 lot for a group home. They still get to see that notice. We have the concept, the sketch plat process, the preliminary plat and final plat for them to come and either voice concern with where that group home is located in the property. In some cases, there might be more buffering requirements. The group home going on in the project still has to meet the guided density from our comp plan. So it's not like they can put a 60-unit group home into the single-family neighborhood. We're trying to be context sensitive with how these things are done. So totally understand that the initial reaction is, yep, that's different. How is anyone going to know? I just want everyone to be on the same page that you're still going to go through those typical processes. We're just allowing for those uses if they're done in a way that's harmonious with the surrounding area. And I think there are plenty of examples, and we're pretty close here, that Laketown elementary school is usually the less threatening of any of those other ones on the list. But if someone was going to come in with an elementary school, that's usually a big driver for why people are going to live in a neighborhood. But let's go up to the example I was referring to next to Lions Park. So you've got Bethesda Lutheran. I think there's 18 total units in here. They have about a 5-acre parcel. Again, they're still in that kind of low density configuration. They're fairly isolated. They've got kind of this ribbon of trees around the project because they are, from a use standpoint, they're different than a traditional single-family home. So we'd go through that process if someone actually wanted to do something like this.
So can we stay on that train of
I made
thought?
that comment, I guess, of why the lot's going to dictate it, because we're still only at 25% coverage of impervious surface. We're talking parking lots, sidewalks, usually on group homes. So that's, I mean, we're still only at 25%, no matter how big the group home is. That's what I mean, the lot would have to be that big to take on a larger group home.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So,
No, that's fair. I wasn't picking on you for the
no, I
comment.
was just, that was my mind thought on that, that's all.
Right, but can we go back to your first example now, if you pan down? Because I'm trying to put my new resident hat on,
Yep.
right? And
Please.
because while I respect the process and what you just described makes complete sense to me, I'm thinking of, so there's a scenario that you just described where these homes are developed, and I'm somebody new moving to the city of Victoria, and I want to buy that home on that corner of Woods and Lakeside Drive, for example, right?
Yep.
And today, before I purchased that home, I believe that across the street, that is either agriculture or it's slated to be R1,
Yep.
or maybe is R1 today. And I purchased that home thinking, well, it's going to be residential, that's fine. But then 5 years later, I find out that across the street, a cemetery is going to be built, or utility services with service trucks is going to be built, or a municipal facility that has lots of traffic across the. So while I respect the fact that I would get notice, and I can come to the city and I can express my frustration and all those things, the reality is that those uses are allowed, and my voice is not likely to shape it so now I'm frustrated as a new resident that I bought my home thinking that there's residential and adjacencies, but there are these other things that while we think they might be compatible, they may not be,
Okay.
either based on perception or reality. So like that, so that's the scenario that I'm thinking about.
Unfortunately, it's a real risk. I mean, think about what we've just been through with the downturn of the market. There's been a lot of plats that have been redone. I can cite numerous sites that were platted out to be X, Y, or Z and came back ABC just because the market changed.
Yeah.
We locked everything up for 5 or 6 years as a state or community market, both locally and nationally. And that scope just changes. You do the best you can to disclose to the new resident coming in, both publicly with the city, publicly, and then professionally in the industry, but you just don't know.
Yeah, and I understand that risk, but I also the reason I'm voicing this concern is simply because it's part of the main reason that we're thinking about this differently.
Absolutely.
Because I mean, one of the first comments that you've made when we went down this process is managing expectations, and both with developers as well as home buyers.
Yep.
And so I'm just bringing up that perspective so that we're kind of like what you had mentioned, Todd, if we're concerned about grouping seemingly compatible uses, but they may not be, maybe in some ways we're managing expectations because we're upfront with saying that all those can be there, and therefore the risk is inherent, as opposed to trying to break them out and say they either can't be there or they can only be there by some other process, either conditional use or.
So the only differentiation I'd make in where you're going with this is I think it's totally this is the time to have the discussion about what's compatible and what's not. The one thing that I do feel like is misleading to any resident right now is using that conditional use with the intent that it's going to do something different with expectations. Because really a conditional use just says there are other things that we want to factor in, and as long as you meet those other factors, it's still allowed. It's not a variance. You're really just saying there's other things you have to do if you're coming in with this use in this area, and as long as you do them, you basically get approval from the city.
So I'm actually starting to come around to that perspective now, because you're right. If you break them out and make them a conditional use permit, there's almost this false sense of I'm going to be able to stop it.
Right.
And that's actually not the idea behind it.
Correct.
And there would have to be some type of violation or gross neglect of the property to rescind the CUP in the first place.
Correct.
Difficult to enforce.
Difficult.
Not likely, right?
Yeah, and there's other things in place that the state allows us from a building rehabilitation and, what do they call it, a housing program, that they have to keep it in shape, otherwise enforcement can be taken, so.
Right.
To me, this
Some-
brings, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go
To me,
ahead.
this brings a lot more clarity than we've ever had in the past. Because coming in, if I were a developer, I can actually look at the roadmap, okay, this is what they're expecting. I met with a local developer recently, and looking at an R1 district, and what he wants to do is not going to conform with what we're proposing. So it just makes things a lot clearer, because I don't think we're overly clear today.
Sure.
Even going back to the fire, I think the fire makes good business sense, but I think we need to look at maybe an exception for certain floor plan styles, if that's possible.
Sure.
Sure.
Something else to consider too is through the use of a PUD, we don't always know what they're going to look like until they get here. So if we are able to stand on something saying this property is zoned as R2, this is what we're seeing to be in this area, as opposed to a PUD, which they can change a lot of things within that. So they can have smaller lots, they could have, as long as they stay in that density threshold, at least with the different residential districts, we would have something to stand on saying, this is what we foresee the property to have, as opposed to a PUD, which allows greater flexibility. But personally, I think if I was living in that house, could be a little scarier if we had no idea what might be happening, what might come in with the PUD.
Yeah.
You know, and another thing to add to that, I at first I thought, well, this is the type of, these principal use, some of these should be in with higher density people, because the value of a low density single family home is usually higher. But when I look at the impervious surface coverage, when you get R2, R3, it goes to 35 and 50%. So now we're talking more building per buildable area, which shrinks the green space of the lot and the lot itself. So it does make it higher density. I like the idea of it being spread out with a 25% impervious coverage. I just didn't know if it should have been a conditional use, but the way you explained it kind of flipped my mind on that, so.
Question.
Yeah, I think I talked myself full circle too. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
As we look at impervious surface, are we considering some of the new technologies that they got the porous asphalts now? They got different technologies being used today that may or may not be considered impervious or hard surface.
But that's factored in, right? I mean, if they come in with an innovative surface, that doesn't count against their impervious surface
Correct.
allowance.
We have that discussion actually somewhat frequently with people that have either moved into a new house or they're rehabbing an existing home, where they're either maybe wanting to put on an addition, or instead of having an open deck that usually doesn't count against impervious if there's nothing hard surface below it, maybe they're making it a covered deck. We're having the discussion of, in order to get there and stay within your impervious surface level, you need to convert your walkway from your driveway to your front door into some permeable surface, or maybe a portion of your driveway, those types of things. Maybe they have an accessory building that they aren't using, they actually want the addition, remove that and get to that thing. So I think all of that is discussion that we regularly have today.
So can we use this land as a quick example? Can you talk about maybe how the process would work today versus how it would work tomorrow with this? So I can kind of, I'm trying to picture in my head what's the benefit to the, Victoria, the residents in general, in transparency for one, and number two, my worry has always been, no matter what we zone something, it almost doesn't matter because we can always rezone something, we can always do additional uses, so that no matter how transparent we are, there's this sense from the community that, well, it doesn't really matter, they can do whatever they want anyways, right? So, I said a lot there, and I'll let you.
No, that's okay. So going through the scenario under the conditions that exist today, so this was done as a PUD. If you looked at our residential district that is there today, this development does not meet all of those objectives. So if we had someone that came in, probably initially sat down with Aaron and I to say, hey, I want to do a housing development on this vacant ag piece right next to Washerman Lake Woods, what zoning do I need? So our response is, well, where do you feel like the market is for the type of housing you're looking for? Most of the time today, and why we're making this migration to more straight zoning, is that someone coming in with what we would view today as a traditional housing development, so any of these projects here, if anyone wanted to be consistent and just say, maybe Pulte wants to do another development and they want it to be here. Well, we want to do the same type of lots and same types of housing we did literally right next door. They'd have to do a PUD. This property owner here is just going to get a notice saying Pulte's coming in with the PUD. Come to the meetings and find out exactly what's involved in that PUD. Because maybe it shifts a little bit. Maybe they don't have the clubhouse like they did before. Maybe a few of the lots are a little bit smaller or different. Maybe the setback need that they're seeing in the market is a little bit less than what they had there. All of those factors come into play. It really just creates this ambiguity as to, well, you're saying PUD, that's where you're getting the response from the public of like, well, they basically do whatever they want.
Yeah. So that's how it works today.
That's how it works today. So how it would work tomorrow is we're going to have the conversation of what type of housing are you looking for. We've got an R2 district proposed that will meet most of the needs of what is being done around this property. So when they come in and, well, what zoning do I need? Well, here's the zoning we have. These are the minimums that you'll have to achieve with all of your lots and home types. It'll meet probably a 98% of what they need in all cases to get the lot arrangement and the economies of scale. There's probably going to be a few places, because it's more of a straight line zoning, that they have to work a little bit harder to make sure that they can still fit everything the way that they would want to, but it's more straightforward for them. They know coming into it, when they have their designer start day one of laying out the property, okay, I need 70-foot wide lots, they have to be this deep. All of these things are easy for them to start to identify, okay, this is how many lots is actually reasonable for me to fit on this piece of property.
Okay.
I think it becomes a win-win for both the city, the community, and the developer. We're setting the expectation going up front versus the developer coming in and saying, well, what can I get out of this thing?
Yep.
And trying to massage something. We've got some projects here in the community that probably look good on paper that probably don't work as well as they might have looked on paper. I think it's going to give us nicer looking communities, nicer looking city, and just be the expectation set. But they're always going to come back and push. We want to add one more lot. One more lot is just bottom line dollars to the developer. Probably going to try to get 1 or 2 more lots out of the deal, but setting the expectation going forward, I just think makes everybody's job here a lot easier and gives us a better project.
So that's the key piece of this, though, right? By going to straight zoning, it in some ways empowers you, Ben, or the city with that first conversation with the developer to get away from, well, yeah, I want to do R2, but can I have 7.5 foot setbacks?
No.
Come on, I want to do I'll do R2, but with a PUD overlay, right? Can I squeeze those setbacks back? But what you're saying is that by going to straight zoning, you're more empowered to say, we're not going to have that conversation unless there's something truly unique and different about what you're proposing.
Correct.
You're either R2 or you're R3. You got to pick one.
That's
Correct. And this evaluation piece that we're doing leading up to discussions like tonight is making sure that what we're presenting meets market conditions that we've already seen success in. We're not trying to be so crazy or out of whack with the market that we're still going to have people like, but that just doesn't work. We're trying to come with, this will work, and I think most people will see acceptable if it's implemented this way.
So how do we build flexibility into that? Because there was probably once upon a time someone had good intentions and did the same thing with previous ordinances, and then it only takes a few years before we start hearing developers come to us and say, well, it doesn't reflect market conditions. Market conditions say we need 5.5 foot setbacks. So you guys got to change ordinances, or we need to do PUDs.
Yeah, what will typically happen is you'll want to see a major, and I don't want to be like so overbearing on that, but there have to be a major shift in the market to where we would look at one of our ordinances and say, these are the things that we maybe need to change so we can accommodate this new market condition.
Okay.
I'd rather be saying, you can be successful with our ordinance, not our ordinances don't meet market conditions.
So the way this is structured, if they wanted to go outside the zoning, is a variance the only way?
Yes, other than I would say to anyone that a variance is always an uphill battle. You'd have to demonstrate a lot, do a lot of work to prove that one little change, like 1 foot of side yard setback change or 5 feet of a front yard setback difference, actually materially matters to your project.
So
I just don't see it that way. Basically, what we're saying is straight zoning should be able to meet the needs of the market and our comprehensive plan for how we've guided density across the city. If you can't do that, it should be unique enough where you are coming in with a PUD with a very different application, a very different housing type than what's possible in the straight zoning.
So PUD is still part of the inventory,
Yes,
still something they can do.
correct.
Okay. Okay. So how does that change the dynamics from today? How does that stop the problem from continually happening, right? If they know they can still do a PUD.
PUD becomes much easier an easy request to say no to if we're really setting up the PUD to say it has to be drastically different than what is feasible with our straight zoning. That's the only time that a PUD should be used, is when you're doing something completely different.
So to answer your question even more directly, the reality is that you, as city staff, have a role, but the planning commission has another role, right? Because you can tell a developer no, or strongly suggest no, you shouldn't go down that path. But he still reserves the right to push forward against your advice and
Sure.
bring it to a planning commission and say, I want to do a
They
PUD.
come in with a concept.
And the planning commission, if we're in sync and we're standing behind the ordinances that we organize, we are empowered to say no. We're not going to recommend approval to council, and therefore council can go forward with it. So I think that there's a cultural shift if this is the direction that we're going in terms of managing expectations, but then actually sticking to it and not waving as a commission, waving for that 1 foot departure, and instead sort of sticking to the philosophy we were going forward with.
Yeah, and the other big difference is someone coming in proposing an R1 or a residential zoning district in the city today likely can't meet all of our requirements, including the comprehensive plan density. If we just did a quick analysis of what those lots mean by doing an R1 subdivision, they likely can't get 1.5 units per acre. In some cases, maybe, but it would be rare.
But you think they can with this R1?
They can with R2. What we tried to do with R1, I don't remember if Aaron said this already, we tried to leave R1 as exactly what the residential district is, so we're not changing existing conditions in the community. So we have properties that are just residential districts today, not PUDs. We don't want to all of a sudden be changing what their expectation is of properties around them.
Right, but if a new development came in today and wanted to develop strictly R1, can they meet the density, the 1.5 density?
Again, I would say it'd be a rare circumstance. We're probably going to see much more use of that R2 zoning district, would be my expectation going into these changes.
So I'm just wondering if we're setting ourselves up to effectively not be able to leverage R1 and either always push to an R2 or always be evaluating PUDs in an R1 situation, just because they're going to come and say we can't meet the density, and so now we need different setbacks or different requirements to meet it.
This is totally the time to have that conversation. We just wanted to be sensitive to existing neighborhoods. There aren't a ton, but there are existing neighborhoods that are just zoned residential today that we didn't want to feel like we were all of a sudden we adopt a new R1 that has slightly different conditions that are allowed, and your neighbor comes in and all of a sudden they got this huge addition going on that wouldn't have been allowed under today's zoning district.
Yeah, although any residential district zone today, I mean, once you enact this ordinance, basically there's a line in time that says there's, before this ordinance.
If they just,
And
if it were literally taking the residential district that's there today and calling it R1, and the provisions of R1 are changing, they can still do that if it's just that standalone ordinance. The same reason we're not touching the Lake Minnetonka residential district. That's a unique subsect of the community that.
So even existing homes would now be subject to the new R1 rules associated with it.
If they're only zoned R1. If they don't have a PUD overlay on them, yes.
Is there a way to overcome that? So what I'm hearing you say is that in order to sort of keep the legacy R1 district in play, it's in some ways it's forcing us to implement an R1 district that actually is not achievable for new development. So we're kind of stuck between legacy information and new rules that actually don't apply. So we're like, in some ways, R1 is only becoming legacy
Sure.
information. And
We could definitely have a very short line that says any property zoned residential prior to X date follows that old set of regulations. I'm just not sure how we keep what was in place active for them to refer to then.
or should there be an R1 that is more aligned with future standards, and instead there's a R1E for existing? Or like, are we missing a
Sure.
legacy residential zoning that can sort of capture all that grandfathered rules
think
and
if
regulations,
the-
so to speak?
If the preference in talking through this from the commission is that we want to be able to use whatever the new R1 district is, we're fine. We went back and forth. Aaron had some changes to R1 that we had talked about that made a lot of sense in our minds to get to something that could achieve that 1.5 units per acre. And we just decided to go back to exactly what it is today. We can figure out that legacy piece. That doesn't have to be completely vetted out tonight. But if the commission generally thinks that in going through this process of creating an R1 district that we should be able to use it, which makes sense, I get it, we're happy to have that conversation.
Just for clarity, my little pea brain, why do you see a challenge in hitting the 1.5 units per acre with the existing rules?
Because if I take that minimum lot area, that's 17,500, and I divide it by a 40,000 or a 40 acre parcel, I'm gonna be close to like 1.1 units per acre by the time I put in roads and I gobble up space with infrastructure and things like that.
I think there's a simplicity to making that adjustment. It seems not as streamlined to create a new set of ordinances and then on day one, but you can't really use R1. It's like, well, why did we do that to ourselves, right? But if there's a distinction between let's create an R1 that's actually usable and achievable and gives one more tier of flexibility to developers or the community, and then create a fifth zone, which is for legacy information. I kind of like that R1E for existing or something like that.
We'll figure out
Sort
some
of clear
way
and
of that.
intuitive.
Yep.
That sort of that handles prior to a certain date. I think residents in the community can have pretty clear understanding whether their development was in place before or after that date and time.
Good point.
Great discussion.
Can I ask a question about, well, I don't know if I'm skipping ahead. We were talking about principal use, it seemed like, but I have a question about accessory use.
Sure.
Do you have that stuff on here? Or is it on the ordinance?
Like when we, like I guess it's item 4 under each, we got permitted accessory use. And it lists the different accessory uses. Can you build any combination of those? I thought there was a restriction before that you could only choose like up to a combination of 2. It was either 2 out of 3 or
3, yep.
now we've actually got a list of 5 or 6, any combination of 2, but not to exceed 2.
So that is in our general regulations for all residential districts, that it says you can't have more than 2 of an attached garage, a detached garage, or a shed.
Do you think that there's merit to either referencing that section, either by saying, there's limited combinations of the following per such and such section, or because it's kind of tempting, it looks like all the information is here and it's like, oh, I can have a 900 square foot garage, plus I can have a greenhouse, and I can have a huge shed in addition to that.
Sure.
And do we really mean that you can have an accessory shed of 900 square feet as opposed to the 150 or 200 foot
We just
shed?
had this discussion.
That's what's in there today.
That you can have a 900 foot storage shed?
150 to the 200 part that you're thinking about is when the building permit kicks in. So if you currently build a shed that's 100 square feet, we bring it in on a zoning permit. If you go 200 or over, that's the building permit.
So
So generally,
we don't have a limitation of an accessory storage shed of 200. That's just a minimum which triggers a building permit.
Yep.
And
What's the difference when you're thinking about a 900 square foot building that maybe has a garage door on it versus one that just has a regular door on it? What's the functional difference?
Well, the difference is you can't have a detached garage if you have an attached garage.
That's not what it says.
I thought that was part of the.
No, it says you can't have more than two.
Right.
So you can't have more than two of three things: an attached garage, a detached garage, and a shed. So if you have an attached garage and a shed, you can't have an accessory garage.
But if you have an attached garage, you can also have a 900 square foot detached garage.
Yep.
For some
Something
reason,
to think about too, the conversations I have often is the impervious surface coverage. So a lot of the homes built today in a PUD, they generally are pretty close to that 35% that adding a 900 square foot garage isn't possible.
Okay.
Because no matter what, you're still limited to the impervious surface coverage.
Correct.
You know, that's the key, and that includes driveways, sidewalks, patio
Everything.
decks that are poured.
You'd have to have a larger lot. So even though most of what we've put together in the matrix is minimums, you'd have to be on a fairly large lot in your new development in order to have both the things that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, aside from my own personal misunderstanding of the
that's
the accessory shed requirements, it does seem to make sense because, I always worry when seemingly most, if not all, the information is there, but then, in terms of managing expectations, it may be worthwhile referencing that there's actually more requirements associated with accessory uses.
One thing that, what you're talking about with the coverage in the buildings and the sheds is, I crunched a bunch of the numbers, and the fact is that when you factor in the impervious surface, let's say R2, single-family lot, 35% of a 10,250 square foot lot is 3,588. So if you built a 2,000 square foot house, John says they're going to be smaller than that, or that's what he's seeing is around 15, 16, 17. Footprint, yeah. And then you put a 900 square foot shed in, or detached garage, that's it. That's what you get as far, you could do an addition on your house and push the impervious surface up, but you wouldn't get to build another shed just because you have impervious surface left. That's kind of how I looked at it. Doesn't allow you another accessory structure
Right.
per se.
Yeah, we get that. But in terms of managing expectations of the average homeowner, sort of thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead and
Yeah.
doing the calculation and understanding how that relates, that
Most of them, honestly, those questions end up funneling their way to us before they even buy the lot or buy the house, or if they're at the onset of like, I had this idea that I got a lot of toys. I probably need some more space. Somehow they end up here and having that conversation early.
Yeah. Do you find that the impervious surface calculation is something that catches people by surprise when they think they can expand or they think they can add another accessory use, but then find out that there's this other requirement like impervious surface?
Sometimes. Most of the time, and I don't know what your opinion is, because you get this at times as well, but a lot of the lots in the kind of the original part of town that are zoned R today that don't actually meet the provisions of the R district, that's where we tend to see most of the question of like, what are you talking about? Like every other house on my street has a detached garage. I can't have a detached garage. So that tends to be a surprise if there are existing conditions around them that are at least have the appearance of being fairly obvious. Like I'm just doing what my buddy did the other day.
Right. Thank you.
So on the permitted accessory uses, let's see, multiples, we cleared that up, square footage. What else did we move ahead? I guess if we're done there, I have a question on conditional uses, and it's more language than anything.
Sure.
Under number 5, conditional uses both in R1 and R2, it's accessory apartments. That's labeling a structure, basically. Could it say accessory dwelling? Because it wouldn't necessarily be an apartment, because it can be detached. It just has to be subordinate and on the back portion of the lot.
Yep, that's a holdover.
Okay.
It's in our current ordinance.
Yeah, it's in our current one, yep.
Yep.
So, and then, I don't know if we've really,
Before you move on from that, we had a discussion before about, what was the,
Temporary health care
thank you.
dwelling units.
Granny pads.
Yep.
Any thoughts about I think it's something that we'll probably get confronted with more and more in the next couple of years, because people are looking for these options either for supporting a parent or kids that are just graduated from college that are looking for their first landing spot, a guest house. We get these things somewhat regularly.
so are we talking about a separate structure on the property or a temporary facility in the driveway, because the state allows that?
I'm asking, now that we're on the topic of this accessory dwelling,
Okay.
Where
are
did
there
we-
any
where did we
thoughts
land?
to that?
Because we had a discussion about
Didn't we
this.
create an ordinance restricting those, I thought? Or is-
No. So the direction we received was we didn't like the language that had been put together, and we were going to come back and discuss what our own language might want to look like.
We had this dilemma, Jeff, I don't know if you remember, probably 6-7 years ago, and we didn't have any language in place. And I think there was a legal thing where we had to allow this accessory structure. And the planning commission recommended no. And we forwarded it to the council, and the council approved it. And this structure ended up not even close to principal dwelling, not behind it, not subordinate, and valued 4 times as much as the existing structure. I think that's what we were trying to avoid, and that place is still in place right now,
Yeah.
within the community, and that's what we want to avoid, is a situation like
And
that.
And
the
so the reason that I'm asking for clarification, jumping back to what we were talking about earlier with conditional uses, right now we just say an accessory dwelling unit is permitted as a conditional use, but I don't have any conditions for them to meet.
I thought we did in the original, then we listed as must be subordinate of the same building materials.
You guys might have gone through draft language with Holly, and I think we
Yeah.
can look into that.
We did.
But I was just curious,
Okay.
gut reaction.
I definitely want to see something put in place for that.
We should evaluate it.
Or restricted it with,
One of the other challenges, Todd, that like with that instance is that whether it's conditional use or not, once it's approved, then it's there. But like in the instance that you mentioned, now it's built, and I've seen some draft language that says, well, you can build it, but when you go to sell your property, you've got to tear it down, right? Because it's only for you. But the reality is nobody's going to tear down that second home on the property.
Well, it's either that or the new owner conforms to the condition, because it goes forward with the property if the conditions are still met.
Right.
So he doesn't turn it into rental property.
They can't rent it out.
Right,
you know.
that would be one of our conditions, does not become rentable property. It's only for use of family that's something else we discussed.
Is that one of the conditions that you think is appropriate?
I've seen it in other communities.
I'm
And I,
fully asking out of curiosity of what's the expectation of what that accessory dwelling.
I would agree with that statement.
non-rental, yeah, for me, anyway, yep. Because it's usually located in an R district, R1, if you will, because of the larger lot.
I mean, I remember when we talked about this, there's an honorable intent around allowing situations like this, but it can quickly spiral out of control and misalign with that intent. Either for rental property or, just more transient nature, which likely doesn't align with expectations in a residential district. And so it's likely to cause conflict. And also I remember a lot about difficult enforcement. I mean, who's going to go banging on doors and checking IDs and checking history to understand whether you are in fact a cousin or a family member or a friend or
Yep.
who's going to enforce it? And once it's built, it's there. And even if it starts getting abused, it's unlikely to influence. Now it's in that community, and it's a potential nuisance if not managed well. I'm kind of speaking from memory of what some of the discussion was. But.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I remember it quite well because it's just something I remember because there's people involved that I knew and how it all happened was, I didn't think the process was right, but I didn't really get to have any other say than the council accepting it.
But I think we did learn a lot from it,
We certainly
and I think began to shape an ordinance that started to address it explicitly. And I guess I'd strongly encourage us to
We'll
bring
jump
it back
to what that language
and talk
is.
about it.
Okay. We'll probably just bring that back for a separate discussion.
Okay.
Because part of what I want to understand, almost to your point, if it's a conditional use that allows for this accessory dwelling and we identify these conditions, or it has to be a relative or part of a family member, after that family member's gotten past their use of that space, now you've got this space, most people are going to be compelled to try to do something with it. Mm-hmm. At least what we can come back and talk about is I'd like to think through, is the conditional use more appropriate because it can be revoked? If it's being rented and we just spell out if it's rented, I'm just going to throw things out there just to think on. You have to have one parking space per occupant, either covered or maybe it's just open, so they're not kicked out. They're not on the street constantly. Can only have a maximum of one bedroom per accessory unit.
Todd will remember other things like a single common mailing address and a single source of utilities as opposed to,
Sure.
splitting the utilities in any way.
Yeah.
And then temporary versus permanent. I mean, I think we got to think about the intent and the nature of it and whether or not temporary structures versus permanent structures are appropriate and in which situation
Right.
one
and
versus
if
the
it
other.
is temporary, what we'll have to get into is there's got to be a financial obligation that either the city's holding until that temporary structure gets torn down, if it's temporary. Otherwise, it never gets torn down.
It just has to be an escrow type account, that we do for a lot of buildings when you build new buildings and until there's a substantial completion or they meet the goals,
Yep. But if you spend $80,000 to build an accessory dwelling, if I hold 5, what are you more compelled to care about?
Don't know that, don't have that situation. I have to think about that, but I get your point.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember there seems to be broad consensus that the need is growing or likely to grow with evolving generational needs, but also to not address it is going to enable it in a very different way than to just be explicit about expectations, manage expectations, and then not let it sort of spiral out of control, which has the potential.
Do we as a community even need to allow it? I mean, if somebody has that need for care or whatever use it needs to be, can they not make some sort of change to the condition of their existing structure to allow that use within their existing structure? Or if they need something bigger and better and beyond that, the big trend right now is building multi-generational homes, and maybe they have to relocate to a different neighborhood that allows that. And most neighborhoods allow that, the structures are being built to accommodate that.
And that's what we're talking about, basically, whether it's attached or detached.
And it's,
And that's
I
the
think-
big thing in Minnetonka. That's what they're doing now. They're
Yep.
building mother-in-law apartments, grandma apartments with separate entrances and, separate facilities.
And we have a few in Victoria that have been built that aren't considered to be completely detached because they have a common wall, but there's a door between the primary area of residence and this additional one.
And a secondary exit.
We'll just have to come back and talk
Okay.
through that a little bit more. And we'll bring some examples so that we're talking kind of apples to apples of these are things that will happen and
Does the city have any type of licensing for rental property the way it stands?
no.
So that might be a moot point anyway, because it's not illegal to rent out your property.
No. We have plenty of rental homes
Yeah, so.
and neighborhoods all across.
Without being licensed, inspected, and,
Yep.
yep, so,
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
I just wanted to get some kind of reaction of how far you either went in previous discussion or where you might be today. So,
Yeah, and John, just because I thought that was a good comment that you just had, but I remember that question getting asked in this context, and it quickly went down the conversation of either, in the case of special needs, when there's an accident or something happens, and there's a sudden and immediate need for a very different level of care, whether it's for a child or an adult, and the prospect of trying to sell your home and move to another community or make other accommodations that can work for your family. That was one scenario that sort of pushed the group to understanding, like, well, no, there's a need, and there's a need to be able to react fairly quickly to make this accommodation, and that seems to align with the temporary nature of such a facility. And there are, ready-made portable facilities that sort of fall into this camp that you can hardwire and those types of things. And then the other was just the concept of aging with dignity, that there's still a certain amount of independence, and to suggest that as you age, you need to either leave the community or go to some other housing stock, which likely isn't here or where your support group is, or that is likely to, as a community, you're going to want to have ways to enable that, but it may also still be temporary in nature. And, so how do you sort of manage that? Your comment just reminded me of where some of that discussion
All
went.
great points.
Yeah. And I don't know what the right answer is, and I don't know that we landed on like the silver bullet for the right answer, but the more we talk about it, I think the more we just address it openly and explicitly, and it seems like now is a good time if we're trying to connect it to some of these.
We're definitely not the only community thinking about it right now either. So I think there's probably some really good examples out there.
Aaron's right. It's definitely trending right now, just how we deal with it as a community.
Yeah.
When the crane shows up and drops an 800 square foot granny pad behind the house, what I would identify temporary.
Right. Right. And I remember temporary can be, it's one thing to say, well, you can have it for 6 months. It's another thing to say it's renewable every 6 months. And then it's another thing to say, well, no, this can be in place for 2 years, but the idea is that it gives the family 2 years to start making alternative, if the incident is sudden onset, you're basically allowing transition time.
Yep.
And that's one attitude about it. That may not be the right attitude, but more to come.
Fun conversation.
no,
Ben, did you get the reaction you're looking for?
Yeah, I'll be coming back with more information, or Aaron will, one or the other.
Yeah, we appreciate you being part of it.
but one more thing under, not to go back to permitted accessory use.
Yep.
Under letter B, it's accessory storage shed. Do we need accessory there, or is that what a holdover also? Storage shed's a storage shed, it's not really
Yeah,
accessory.
that's
Okay. Just curious, And I have a few more questions in R2 if we want to move on. It's language, once again, under purpose and scope. Once again, I'm going to be the devil's advocate on single-family detached and semi-detached.
We will plan to have definitions for anything that's not building code specific. We should have made that caveat to begin.
And
Yes.
villas, please, villas.
The Todd catch-all
rule.
is that we will have definitions for anything that's not explicitly called out in the building code.
Because when we have legal documents such as ordinances and, any of these that we approve, it should be concurrent or equal to or defined legally,
Yes.
I think.
That is our intent. I know that when I say we, again, it's Erin has a working list of definitions that she's been working on.
I asked 3 building officials today what that meant, a detached home, and they said, don't know. And they've been doing it for 20, 30 years.
Did you ask your planning department?
I did actually, Drew over in our, he
Yep.
goes, I don't know, I've never heard that before.
Darn it.
And villa, he says, that sounds like something you want to buy right now. And he goes, that's a selling phrase, it's not
Yep.
That's-
structure.
Yep.
That's the weird thing, is that it's a marketing phrase, and as soon as cities start putting what the definition of villa is in their ordinances, it's no longer cool to say villa.
That's
Yep.
right.
And they're going to come up with a new name for villa
will.
because it's going to be more
But
marketable.
we'll at least have a
and off.
definition that aligns with that market.
The market for that time, yeah. All right, thank you.
Are there other questions, comments, things that didn't make sense on your first read through?
I like it.
I was head down taking notes. Did you get through the whole presentation? Okay.
Not even close.
Okay.
No, I like, honestly, this is great work. I like the conformity of it, the simplicity of it too, from when I look at it as I compared the two side by side, what's existing and what's not. And you just get lost in the old ordinance. I mean, there's too much there. It's almost too vague. This is, I think, greatly descriptive, gets to the point. If I'm a builder and I've done stuff in the past with development, this is straightforward for what we're looking for. And the answers are here. I'm not going to call you with an answer that's listed within here, whereas our old ordinance, I would have questions of what's acceptable. So this is great work. And as far as what it's replacing, text-wise, this is basically Chapter 109, right, in the zoning and land use, Article 3, zoning districts.
Nope. So the R1 language that you see here is replacing the R residential district chapter. The proposed R2 is a completely new section that would be created. The R3 section generally is replacing the MR, multiple residence district. And the R4 is also, like the R2, a completely new district.
Okay.
And again, the Lake Minnetonka residential will largely go untouched, so that will remain.
They seem pretty similar, so.
Yeah, the other chapter that you were talking about, I would say is more like a general ordinance that talks about things
Bulk
that
and-
generally will happen in all districts, and then it has
Okay.
the table of all the districts. So if you were trying to make a decision as a developer of what kind of zoning do you need, it's a table, one place to go to see how everything compares.
Very good.
No. Sounds like you had more for us, Aaron. Or did we sort of,
Well, I think the only
Jump
thing
so far
we just
ahead
wanted to
that-
make sure, it's been a couple months since we had our last discussion. I think we just want to make sure from a context perspective, everyone's on the same page of what is R1 versus R2 versus R3 versus R4.
So this is a good example of R2 closer to the compact single family that we mentioned. So it's a new term to our zoning ordinance. Two local examples. On the left is Cheval, and the right is Savannah Valley. So two existing developments that would fall pretty close to that R2 district today.
And just to be clear, the left top is street view, below is the aerial view, and then on the right, the aerial view is on top of Savannah Valley, and then the street view below. Questions, thoughts? Okay.
Moving on to R2 development that could happen in the future. So none of these are currently existing in Victoria, but the language speaks to some uses that could be similar to these examples. So again, R2 speaks specifically to single family, compact single family, semi-detached, and townhome. So smaller townhome developments, what we're calling semi-detached or a duplex, and then some smaller single family lots.
In terms of going back to kind of the exercise we had before of new homeowner in a new development, the area across from you is vacant farmland. When would you see all of these uses? Because I'm probably not expecting moving in that a threeplex is going to come in across the street. I would say it would be the example of when people first moved into Deer Run and Lake Town was proposed, that they're going to come in and a developer is going to have a proposal that mixes all of those types as part of their concept, and it'll be part of the overall discussion of why that mix works. Sorry.
So you're suggesting that to avoid, say, an R1 adjacent to the threeplex that you described, that's managed at the review stage in terms of whether it's appropriate to be, even though it's R1 next to R2, you would likely manage the process by suggesting that the smaller homes start to blend into the higher density threeplex homes.
And I think through the nice part of having this ordinance discussion in general is the timing of moving into this next comprehensive plan round. That through that process, one of my personal objectives is to have more understanding in the comp plan of how and where we organize higher density when it's next to one another. Where's the appropriate place and how do we mix them effectively? So I'm hoping that the intent is R2, we allow for this type of development to occur, and the comprehensive plan will provide more guidance and clarity from the developer's end to know when it's going to be appropriate and when it's not.
So can you go back to that other slide?
Yep.
So that message that you just had, to me, is even more reason to distinguish that R1 and R1E, because if we're saying that, as it was written today, R1 really isn't feasible or usable, what we're saying is that R2 covers everything from what we think of being R1 traditional single-family homes in the new world,
Yep.
all the way up to a threeplex. That doesn't necessarily narrow my expectations in terms of what that zone might include. It's sort of almost a catch-all.
Yeah. So based on this idea that when we create the new R1, that it can be different from the residential district that's in place today, from the charts that Aaron's put together, maybe we do want to think about pulling out what we currently have as that, what do you have, single family lot, the top line of R2, and take those provisions, put it into R1. That way it's clear that when you get into these smaller lot single family that are more similar to duplexes or attached units, the expectation of someone coming in for an R2 zoning, we have less possible outcomes. So it'll be clear up front that it's going to be a little bit different than an R1.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
So you're talking about removing the single-family product from R2?
I'm looking at removing the larger lot single family that's in the R2 and moving that information into the R1.
Okay, I got you. Just that top line.
Just the big one, yeah.
Yep.
Questions, comments?
No, that what Ben just said makes more business sense. But now R1 actually becomes something we can actually utilize.
Right, and it sets expectations around R2 is a fairly medium level density that isn't so broad, so I think that's good.
Again, here's just the table of R3 and R4. I think that we may have worked through most of that if we want to move to visual to help picture it. So moving on to R3, which allows for semi-detached townhome or row home at a max of 8 attached units, or multifamily at a max of 36 units.
36 units in one building is still fairly small.
Do you need to see the chart again? Feel okay? Okay.
Yes.
And moving into R4, which allows for the high density, so townhomes and multiple family dwellings. We call out townhomes as having a number of attached units of 12 units per row, and an apartment having 50 units.
It's a pretty good visual representation in terms of a cross-section of those four varying densities.
So when we reach those higher impervious surface densities buildable on the land, how does that jive with the watershed district? Do we have to enforce?
So they still
certain
have to
things?
accommodate that amount of stormwater within their project. So it's because we're somewhat unique, not completely unique, but Victoria is somewhat unique in the fact that we, as a city, take all the stormwater ponds in an outlot. That's not going against the lot where these multiple family dwellings are going. So we're not impacting the overall size of their parcels, but from an engineering standpoint, they still need to accommodate
Sure.
all of the runoff that's generated by that development.
So they have to add to our, 85 ponds we have already?
Yeah.
Well, they put more pressure on themselves, right? Because if they're gonna kick up the impervious surface, they've got to have a heck of a water management plan to
Correct.
deal with all that runoff that's
Yes.
not just
They're getting
passive.
a lot more efficient with that too, I see, with impervious surfaces and holding tanks and reuse.
Slightly different train of thought, but one of the other things we'll be looking at with this comprehensive plan update is regionalized stormwater, so we don't end up with these little pocket stormwater ponds that aren't as efficient and really just adds to our maintenance responsibilities. If we can go into more of a regionalized approach, it'll be better, especially when we get into these higher density areas.
Makes sense.
Is that where that's evaluated at in the comprehensive plan level, or is it?
It's a
or does it have
strategy.
as much to do with like city management goals and financial planning in terms of whether it's sustainable to keep taking on the maintenance and.
We typically fight as much as we can from a staff perspective when someone comes in and they have 3 small piddly little ponds just because of how they want to arrange the subdivision, that we at least are trying to get to 1 or 2. If it was 3, we'd at least feel like we won getting to 2. But through the comp plan, to think big picture, to have, a general vision for the city that we don't want even each individual development necessarily to have its own standalone pond, that we're more efficient and better for the community if we can get into a larger regional system. We'll start there, and then the follow-up would be if we want to implement it in ordinance, it'd be in the subdivision ordinance, not the zoning ordinance.
And so then I'd assume that would trigger some sort of upfront investment by the city to put it in place before the development comes and then share the expense. I mean, there's different financial models to deal with that.
Yep.
But the intent is honorable.
Has there ever been any thought to turning those outlots, or keeping it in the HOA and let them service some of these ponds? Or is that more paperwork and enforcement?
So one of the reasons why the city elected to take on those stormwater ponds was some dialogue that happened, I'm not sure exactly when, but that associations can be really good at estimating costs to replace driveways, to replace siding on association-maintained homes. Stormwater pond maintenance, because we, even as a city today, the regulations of how we deal with silt and cleaning some of those ponds are still unknown. I think the thought was associations aren't going to be prepared to manage those facilities, that it's really going to be in the city's best interest to take them. We collect a stormwater fee on people's utility bills. We're building a fund for something we don't quite fully understand yet, but as soon as we do, we'll have resources that HOAs likely wouldn't without drastically increasing monthly dues.
Yeah, I think your resource for knowledge on that comes from the watershed, and I mean, that's your primary source of resource, or information. And then there's specialty companies that come and do that type of
Yep.
work, but they're almost cost prohibitive for an HOA to cover.
Especially if the HOA is very small.
Yeah.
And then they quickly become a nuisance for residents, not only of that development, but across the street for the adjacent development, and now
Button heads.
button heads, yeah.
That's all I have for the presentation. If there's any questions or comments, otherwise, thanks for the feedback. It was really helpful.
Thank you for the hard work on it. It's very well done.
Good job, Aaron.
Thank you.
Awesome. I don't have anything else, and that's just a discussion item, right? So,
Correct, yes.
do you have a game plan in terms of how you plan to move it forward? Do you have a timeline that you're trying to get this in play?
Like yesterday would have been nice. In conjunction with this one, we're working through the PUD chapter too. So trying to piece it together at once so we have the tools together and so it goes in. So we have that whole toolbox instead of piecemealing it together. I just said together like 10 times, I'm sorry. But over the next few months, we hope to have some pretty solid chunks of it in final draft.
And so you're actually hoping that by spring, this is before council and being enacted?
Correct. Yeah, I think the goal we initially started with, not knowing how some of the conversations will end up, was that sometime mid-April, we probably have the residential districts back before you in kind of a finalized form, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. And between now and then, we'd be, as Aaron was alluding to, we'd bring the PUD ordinance for discussion at the next meeting. If there are other chapters that we feel like we should have changes made before we do a full implementation of all of them, we'll have the discussion so that when we come back, we're coming back with all of them, but you've already had exposure to what changes are being presented, so that we implement and we have everything that's necessary in place at one time, instead of slightly contradictory portions of ordinances here and there.
Mm-hmm. Good. Should we move on? Next is council meeting updates.
I didn't go to the meeting, but I watched it on the video or the live feed for half of it and the tape of the rest of it. And the biggest discussion was on stormwater existing, how to take care of it, where the monies are going to come from, how to treat stuff that isn't up to today's standard. What can we do to help, like Schutz Lake, it was an example given. And the guy from the watershed district was here and explained how much better the standards are now and what they can do to help out with stuff like that. And we have a stormwater fund, but like you said, it's not directed to anything right now. There's some discussion on that, but I think the council agreed that we have to do something because we are the city of parks and lakes. And if our lakes are becoming impaired like Wasserman is, that was a discussion how Wasserman is, it's a mud hole right now. I mean, it's terrible. And it's one of our impaired waters. that we can't let that happen to other lakes around here, and we can avoid that by taking action. Because a lake will go rotten in 3 years, but it'll take you 15 years to repair it. It was kind of the point, so.
So not having been a part of that discussion, how broad is the discussion? I mean, are they talking about it from like a engineering standpoint, or is this getting into development standard, like, you know, all the things that we just talked about in terms of how we develop and the guidelines and the setbacks, and is that where the conversation is going to?
What Todd was referring to is really a spin-off conversation that happened as part of presenting a new opportunity for the community, for the council to consider. What I have pulled up here on the map, there's a piece of property just off of Wasserman Lake that is for sale, has been. The pond that resides within part of that property is one of the primary pollutant loading areas into Wasserman. The watershed district had approached staff several months ago just asking if they went forward and pursued purchasing the property to do a water quality project there. If just from staff's initial reaction, if we thought the city would consider buying back the usable portion of that property as a public park that would be right on the lake. The reaction we had from council during the meeting on just kind of that concept, not knowing exactly how do we pay for it, what the timing looks like, what kinds of improvements would go in there, just the thought of improving water quality to help Wasserman, that is an impaired lake, as Todd had mentioned, and gain public access possibilities through a public park was something they thought would be a beneficial thing to see if we can make that happen. The Minnehaha Creek Watershed District is going through due diligence, and part of their due diligence period in their purchase agreement is that they'll work with the city to go through our process of developing a concept, presenting it to Park and Rec Committee, and ultimately coming up with some financial plan of how that might be feasible before they'd make the final determination as a district to close on the property. So I'll certainly be happy to keep this group informed. We don't deal directly with park improvements per se, but this is kind of a unique situation that as we get into the kind of that concept phase, I'll make sure that you're aware of kind of where things are headed with that.
Is the watershed district participation like in the context of a pilot project or like experimentation in some way?
They've done similar types of things like this elsewhere in the district. The biggest one that they talk about was an improvement around, when I was going to drop, it's in St. Louis Park. Is it Methodist Hospital?
With the creek there.
Yes.
Yeah, they realigned the creek back to its.
They realign the creek. They have some public access in terms of boardwalks. They've got a public education piece. So they've done similar types of things where they came in and they helped as a conduit for the city to come in and have some access and make it an active corridor. Similar principle in a sense. This would be the first time that they'd be working with the community on acquisition to be a park instead of just a repurposed corridor.
Right. And I was thinking in context of like lessons learned. I mean, if there are activities that they do on site that is in the vein of improving the water quality, and there are things that are done in this case that can be applied to other similar cases throughout the community.
Yes.
That seems like a good synergy
Yes.
with long-term benefits. And
Yeah. One of the reasons this has risen to the top for them, multiple reasons, I guess, but the big is this is a part of their focal geography effort right now to improve 6 Mile Creek. It's very near the headwaters of the entire 6 Mile Creek. It's also in an area, as we can all appreciate, that has a lot of development pressure. Which is usually where they're trying to be proactive versus reactive. And if this goes well, if this becomes a successful model, it is something they've said that, particularly in this area in Victoria and other areas within 6 Mile that are developing, they would certainly look at similar efforts in the future.
Cool.
Can't remember what else was on there, but
We had the few ordinance cleanup items that were discussed last time with this group. Where, we talked about construction time, the notification when new rezonings are proposed that we're not going to include in that 600-foot determination any public waters or public rights-of-way. And what was the third one?
The supermajority.
Supermajority vote of council.
And they were in alignment with the discussion that we had, or
Yes.
no? Yeah.
Other than I don't know that they had a specific opinion on any changes to the construction time frames that are in our ordinance. And I don't know that it was necessary that they had to. It didn't translate into anything of like, maybe we'd prefer it to be 8 to 6 on the weekend instead of 8 to 8 like it is today. There wasn't really like a initial reaction of, oh man, we're really missing the mark here. So it may just be something that if it comes up again, we might just present it for thought, or maybe someone will reach out to them and it'll start the conversation again.
what brought that forward in the first place?
Just over the past couple of years, especially with more and more developments being spread around the community, it tends to be a reoccurring theme if someone hasn't lived next to new construction either in a while or ever. So it's more just one of those, this is what we're hearing. Do you think we should be looking at changes? If not, put it on the shelf for the time being until it surfaces again and we can look at it then.
So you're saying that when you say this is what we're hearing, are you talking about complaints?
Yes.
Do you track those? Like, would you be able to summarize, like, in the last 2 years, you've gotten X number of complaints in the evenings and X number of complaints? Because that might be the data that actually drives change. If there's 1 or 2 complaints a year, that's one thing. If over the years there's been a pretty steady, data that says, geez, at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evenings on a Saturday, we always get complaints. That's something different.
Yeah, I would say we have not collected that information specifically, because a lot of the time, specifically with construction traffic, that could go to our Carver County deputy that's on patrol that day. It might come to Public Works. Either someone's calling there, or we have Public Works out doing work in a neighborhood and someone's like, hey, did you know they started at 7 o'clock yesterday? Or we get calls at City Hall.
Yeah. I know this isn't a topic for discussion, and we didn't think of this when we were talking about it, but that actually could be an interesting action item, which is say, let's, city monitor it as best you can.
Yep.
Just making note of those sources that you talk about over the course of a year or this season, and then evaluate it from there, because then there's data.
It could be corralled, using anyone that takes that phone call, as far as city staff or employees go, to send them to the website and say, place your complaint at this port.
Yep.
And send it in there.
And we get some through the website.
Because then
as
you could
well.
tally them all off of one site or one.
Yep. Good thoughts. Just looking if there was anything else. I think those are all the big things. Todd mentioned the discussion about Schutz Lake. It's not at the stage like Wasserman where it's not impaired today. But through the Waterford Landing project, a lot more collaboration just amongst lake residents, where we've got people willing to kind of look into things a little bit more. So just getting feedback from council that they do want staff to spend some time helping to facilitate that discussion, working with the watershed district on what they will be doing through their comprehensive plan process that's ongoing right now. just kind of leveraging resources where we can to better understand what's driving pollutants into that lake. Outside of that meeting, the only other thing I was going to bring up, we did have a special meeting in the city council last night to interview applicants that had applied to serve on the comprehensive plan steering committee. After the interviews were done, they did have an actual action meeting where they made appointments. We did have 9 people selected to participate in that. In addition to the 9 applicants, we did have appointments of people that had volunteered from existing committees. From Planning Commission, we had Jeff and John that had both volunteered. They were appointed last night. So very appreciative of having representation from the Planning Commission on that group. It'll be a good mix of people and backgrounds moving forward. And as I mentioned last time when I just asked for volunteers, Jeff and John serving on that committee won't be the only people from the Planning Commission involved in the overall process. But as we come up with what that engagement process looks like big picture, I'll make sure that you're all aware of when public open houses are, when things might be coming to Planning Commission for reaction as kind of a collective group, those types of things.
I'm actually really looking forward to bring it back to this group.
Him as well.
Just because I've learned the tremendous amount of value and perspective this group has, so I'd be happy to be a part of that conduit as well. So,
Deal. And I know briefly mentioned it before the meeting started tonight, but what you see on the wall behind, if you haven't taken a look more closely, was a focused conversation we had between the interviews last night and when the council actually made determine a selection of those applicants, just to see kind of what things they heard and some of the positive expectations they have about what the committee will do in the comprehensive plan process. Thought it was very interesting that kind of up front there was kind of acknowledgement from all of them that what was stated by the residents that in many cases none of them had met before or interacted with, that they all had inherently an understanding of the community just like the council was. There wasn't a topic or something that came up through that interview process that they hadn't necessarily heard about. So it was kind of reassuring that the people that are looking to get involved, they're all relatively informed.
that's great.
Otherwise, that's what I have for council meeting updates.
Anything under miscellaneous tonight?
I had a question. Can you scroll up 43 a little bit for me since we're here?
How far up?
Up to Ambergate.
Okay.
And there's a parcel just south of that holding pond. Can you zoom in on that?
In here?
Yep. We talked about earlier, Jeff Potterford pointed out how we gonna police some of the stuff that we're doing.
Are we talking about this property?
The one across the street.
Okay.
I drive by that a lot lately because I've done some business in that back neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not overly attractive. It's collected a whole bunch of stuff. Is that okay? Under our current ordinances?
It's an existing condition that was built around.
Okay.
It's much more able to be seen than before the development occurred. So we've walked a fine line with understanding that that was an existing condition. It was annexed into the city in a similar condition. But yes, we are aware of it.
The visible portions of the backside of the house too is backyard where he stores stuff, so that's the unsightly portion of it. You know, the front of the yard is relatively nice looking, you know. So
When this picture was taken recently, this stuff's kind
not
of
around the front though. You haven't probably drove up into his front yard.
I've been actually driven the RDA, see most of it driving down at Ambergate now, and it just looks different than some of the other stuff that we've talked about
Yeah.
developing and moving forward with. It's not congruent with the community.
Not at all. Not, no, it isn't.
It's a good note.
That's not,
That's that enforcement thing we talk about.
but that makes sense if it was existing is what it is.
Yep.
Other items that are miscellaneous? No? I move that we adjourn. Is there a second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Have a good evening.
You never ask if anyone's opposed.